She said a name she wasn't supposed to know. Just 3 syllables, spoken casually across the kitchen counter on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Her husband froze mid-step, keys dangling from his fingers, and in that single moment of silence, their entire marriage cracked open. This is the story of how one woman's intuition became the thread that unraveled everything, and how sometimes the most devastating truths hide behind the most mundane lies. What happened next would change not just her life, but the way she understood the 8 years they'd spent together. Hello, friends. If you're watching this story, I want you to subscribe to Folktale Stories right now. Turn on that notification bell so you never miss another story like this one, like this video. And please, before we continue, comment your country below. Let me know where you're watching from. It means so much to me to know who's hearing my story. Now, let me take you back. This story begins in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Portland, Oregon, where Sarah Mitchell lived what most people would call a comfortable life. She was 34, worked as a graphic designer from home, and had been married to David for 8 years. They weren't wealthy, but they were stable. They had inside jokes, a shared Netflix account, and that easy rhythm couples develop when they've memorized each other's morning routines. David worked in sales for a tech company, which meant irregular hours, frequent client dinners, and a phone that buzzed constantly. Sarah had learned not to feel threatened by his demanding job. She trusted him because trust was what you did when you loved someone, and she loved him deeply, in that quiet, unglamorous way that sustains real marriages through ordinary years. Their apartment smelled like the lavender candles Sarah bought in bulk from the farmer's market every month. Mornings meant coffee in mismatched mugs, David scrolling through emails while Sarah sketched logo concepts at the kitchen table. Evenings were predictable. Takeout on Wednesdays, movie night on Fridays, grocery shopping on Sunday mornings. They talked about mundane things like whether to replace the living room rug and when to schedule the car's oil change. These were the threads of an unremarkable life, the kind that feels safe precisely because nothing dramatic ever happens. Sarah's friends sometimes complained about their own marriages, about feeling disconnected or suspicious, but Sarah always felt grateful. She and David still kissed goodbye every morning. He still asked about her projects. He still remembered she liked her coffee with oat milk, not regular. These details mattered to her. They were evidence of love that didn't need grand gestures to prove itself. Or so she believed. The shift was so gradual that Sarah almost didn't notice it. Around March, David started working later. Not dramatically later, just an extra hour here and there, which seemed reasonable given his position. He'd come home apologizing, smelling faintly of cologne she didn't remember him wearing that morning, explaining about difficult clients or urgent presentations. Sarah would heat up his dinner, and they'd eat together while he scrolled through his phone, responding to messages with that focused intensity she recognized as his work mode. Then came the small changes in habit. He started taking phone calls in the bedroom with the door closed. He'd shower immediately after coming home, even on days when he'd supposedly been in air-conditioned offices all afternoon. He became protective of his phone in a way he'd never been before, always placing it face down, always swiping away notifications before she could glimpse them. Sarah told herself she was being paranoid. She'd read too many articles about infidelity, watched too many movies where these exact patterns preceded revelations of affairs. She refused to become that wife, the suspicious one, the one who checked pockets and demanded passwords. She chose trust instead. But intuition isn't paranoia, and Sarah's instincts had always been sharp. She started noticing patterns she couldn't explain away. David mentioned a coworker named Rebecca twice in 1 week, both times in passing, both times quickly changing the subject. Sarah filed the name away without thinking much of it. Then, a few weeks later, she overheard him on the phone in the bedroom, his voice lower than usual, saying something that ended with, "I'll handle it, just give me more time." When he emerged, he was smiling, acting casual, asking what she wanted for dinner as if nothing had happened. Sarah felt something twist in her stomach, a feeling she couldn't name but couldn't ignore. She began paying closer attention, not obsessively, but consciously. She noticed he checked his phone the moment he woke up, before even saying good morning. She noticed he'd started going to the gym 3 mornings a week, something he'd never done consistently in all their years together. She noticed he seemed distracted during their conversations, as if part of him was always somewhere else. And then there were the credit card statements. Sarah handled their finances, and while reviewing their shared account, she saw charges from restaurants she'd never been to, at times when David said he'd been working late at the office. It was a Tuesday in late September when everything converged. David came home around 7:30, later than usual, but not suspiciously so. Sarah was making pasta, something simple because she'd been working all day on a logo redesign that had drained her creativity. David kissed her cheek, the gesture mechanical but familiar, and said he needed to run back to the office for a few hours. There was a presentation tomorrow, he explained, and his team needed him. Sarah stirred the sauce, nodded, and felt that twist in her stomach again. She didn't plan what happened next. The words just came out, casual and light, as if she were making a joke. "Okay," she said, not looking up from the stove. "Tell Rebecca I said hi." The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the bubble of the pasta water, the distant sound of traffic outside their window. When she finally turned around, David was standing frozen by the door, his face completely drained of color. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hand, still holding his car keys, had gone slack. For 5 full seconds, neither of them moved. "Who told you that name?" David's voice was barely above a whisper, and that was how Sarah knew. Not because he denied it, not because he got angry or defensive, but because he asked who told her, as if the existence of Rebecca was an established fact he'd been desperately trying to keep hidden. Sarah set down the wooden spoon, her hands beginning to shake. "Nobody told me," she said quietly. "I just know." That wasn't entirely true, of course. She'd pieced it together from fragments. The name mentioned twice, a calendar notification she'd glimpsed on his phone that said, "Lunch with R," a credit card charge from a boutique hotel downtown. But she'd never been certain until this exact moment, when his reaction confirmed everything her instincts had been screaming for months. David sat down heavily at the kitchen table, his face in his hands. Sarah watched him, feeling strangely calm, as if this moment had been inevitable and she'd been unconsciously preparing for it all along. "How long?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red but dry. "It's not what you think," he said, and Sarah almost laughed at the cliché of it. "Then what is it?" she asked. "Tell me what it is, David." What followed was a confession that felt both too much and not enough. David told her about Rebecca, a woman he'd met through work about 8 months ago. She was a consultant on one of his projects, younger than Sarah, ambitious, interested in the same things he was. They'd started having lunch together, then coffee, then drinks after work. It was just friendship at first, he insisted, just someone who understood the pressures of his job in a way Sarah couldn't. But somewhere along the way, the friendship had become something else. He swore they hadn't slept together, though Sarah could see in his eyes that the technical truth of that statement was meant to minimize a deeper betrayal. They'd kissed. They'd talked about a future together. They'd exchanged messages that crossed every line a married man shouldn't cross. David kept saying he was sorry, that he'd been planning to end it, that he loved Sarah and didn't want to lose their marriage. But Sarah barely heard him. She was thinking about all the evenings she'd eaten dinner alone, believing his lies about working late. She was thinking about the mornings she'd woken up next to him, trusting completely in the life they were building together. She was thinking about how easy it had been for him to split himself into two people, the husband who came home to her and the man who belonged to someone else. Sarah asked David to leave that night. Not permanently, not yet, but she needed space to think, and she couldn't do that with him in the apartment, looking at her with those pleading eyes, asking for forgiveness she wasn't ready to give. He left without arguing, gathering some clothes and saying he'd stay with his brother. After the door closed, Sarah sat on the couch in complete silence, the pasta still boiling away on the stove until the water evaporated and the pot began to burn. The smell of scorched metal filled the apartment, but she didn't move. She kept replaying the conversation, searching for signs she should have seen earlier, wondering how she could have been so blind. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself, though that cut deep. It was the realization that while she'd been living in their marriage fully, with complete honesty and presence, David had been living a double life. Every kiss goodbye had been a lie. Every "I love you" had been conditional. Every moment of intimacy had been tainted by the existence of another woman who believed she had claim to the same man. Sarah thought about Rebecca, this woman she'd never met, but whose name she now knew by heart. What had David told her? Did Rebecca know he was married? Or had he hidden that too? Was she waiting for him right now, wondering why he wasn't answering her messages? Sarah couldn't sleep that night. Around 2 in the morning, she did something she'd never done before. She opened David's laptop, which he'd left behind in his hurry to pack. She knew his password because they'd never had secrets before, or at least she believed they hadn't. His email was still logged in, and Sarah began scrolling through his messages, feeling simultaneously guilty and justified. What she found was worse than she'd imagined. Messages between David and Rebecca going back nearly a year, not 8 months like he'd claimed. Hundreds of emails filled with intimacy and future planning. He'd told Rebecca he was unhappy in his marriage, that he and Sarah had grown apart, that he was planning to leave but needed to wait for the right time. He'd told her things about Sarah that felt like violations, private details about their relationship twisted to make Sarah sound controlling and cold. He'd sent Rebecca pictures of himself, carefully cropped to exclude any evidence of his home life. And Rebecca had responded with messages full of affection and patience, telling him she'd wait as long as it took, that she understood how complicated these situations were, that she believed they were meant to be together. Reading those messages, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The pain was still there, but underneath it was something harder and clearer, the understanding that David hadn't just betrayed her once. He'd been actively constructing an alternate reality where she was the obstacle to his happiness, where leaving her was the brave and necessary thing. When David returned the next morning to talk, Sarah was ready. She'd printed out some of the emails and spread them across the kitchen table. When he walked in and saw them, his face went white again, but this time Sarah felt no satisfaction in his discomfort. She just felt tired. "You told me 8 months," she said. "It's been almost a year." David couldn't meet her eyes. "You told me you hadn't slept with her, but these messages tell a different story." He started to speak, to explain, to minimize, but Sarah held up her hand. "I don't want to hear it," she said. "I don't want your version of events where you make this sound less terrible than it is. I want you to know that I know everything." What came out then was the full truth, or at least as much as David was capable of telling. He had slept with Rebecca multiple times, in hotel rooms he'd charged to a credit card Sarah didn't monitor. He'd told Rebecca he was weeks away from asking for a divorce, that he was just waiting for the right moment. He'd been living 2 complete lives, spending weekends with Sarah while texting Rebecca that he couldn't wait to build a real life with her. And the worst part? He genuinely believed he could maintain both relationships indefinitely, that somehow he could keep both women happy without either discovering the other's existence. Sarah listened to all of this with an expression David later said terrified him because it wasn't angry or hurt. It was blank, as if she'd already left him emotionally and was just waiting for her body to catch up. Over the following weeks, David begged for another chance. He ended things with Rebecca completely, showing Sarah the messages to prove it. He suggested couples therapy, promised to be transparent with his phone and schedule, swore he'd spend the rest of his life rebuilding her trust. Part of Sarah wanted to try. 8 years was a long time to walk away from, and she'd loved him deeply enough that the ghost of that love still whispered that everyone deserves forgiveness. But every time she looked at him, she saw a stranger. The man she'd married wouldn't have been capable of this level of deception. The David she'd loved wouldn't have described her to another woman as an obstacle to his happiness. She realized that trying to save the marriage would mean accepting a fundamentally different version of who he was, and she wasn't sure she could love that person. The decision, when it came, felt surprisingly simple. Sarah told David she wanted a divorce not because she couldn't forgive him, but because she couldn't forget. Every moment they'd spent together for the past year was now contaminated by his lies. She couldn't look at their wedding photos without wondering if he'd already been thinking about leaving. She couldn't remember their last vacation without questioning whether he'd been texting Rebecca while Sarah slept beside him. The marriage she believed in no longer existed, and she couldn't build a new one on its ruins. 6 months later, Sarah was living in a smaller apartment across town, one that smelled like fresh paint instead of lavender candles. The divorce had been finalized with surprising efficiency since David, drowning in guilt, hadn't contested anything. Sarah kept most of their savings, the car, and her dignity. She'd started therapy, not because she was broken, but because she wanted to understand how she'd missed the signs and how to trust her instincts better in the future. Friends kept asking if she was okay, and Sarah's answer was always the same. She was getting there. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape, becoming less about what she'd lost and more about what she'd learned. She'd learned that trust, once broken this completely, can't be repaired by promises. She'd learned that her intuition had been right all along, and ignoring it had cost her months of unnecessary suffering. Most importantly, she'd learned that walking away from someone you love isn't failure. Sometimes it's the bravest thing you can do. Sarah heard through mutual friends that David and Rebecca had tried dating after the divorce, but it had fallen apart quickly once the thrill of secrecy was gone. She felt nothing hearing this news, which told her she was finally healing. The name Rebecca, which had once shattered her world, now meant nothing to her. So let me ask you this. What would you have done if you'd been Sarah? Would you have confronted David the moment you felt something was wrong? Or would you have waited like she did, gathering evidence until the truth was undeniable? Could you forgive a betrayal this complete? Or would you, like Sarah, choose your own peace over a damaged marriage? Sometimes the most painful truth is realizing that the person you loved wasn't who you thought they were, and that the life you built together was only half real. But there's strength in that pain, in choosing yourself when staying would mean losing who you are. If this story made you think about your own relationships, about the small signs you might be ignoring or the trust you might be taking for granted, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and whether you think intuition is something we should always trust. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about real people facing impossible choices and finding strength they didn't know they had, subscribe to our channel. Because the truth is, we all carry secrets, and we all face moments when everything we believed gets tested. The question is, what do we do when that moment comes?